Hello, everybody. We're just going to let everybody kind of filter in as per usual. We'll do the awkward stand here for a few minutes, but I see people coming in right now, so it shouldn't be too long, and then we'll get going. Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the, I guess, the third to last virtual SPY seminar series. This is titled Philanthropy to Save the World, Insights for and from Environmental Charities. I'm Chris Clapp from the University of Chicago. So unless you've been living under a rock, I'm sure you're probably aware of the myriad of environmental and climate challenges we currently face. Focusing on the biggest, earlier this week, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released what it described as its bleakest report yet, saying, quote, "The scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet, and any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future." So as I tell my students, the causes of these environmental problems, externalities, and other market failures are well known, as are the solutions to them. For instance, a carbon tax or cap and trade. But the concerted action piece requires just a sort of a lot of coordination, a lot of bringing different organizations together, and that's really difficult to pull off. And that's because of entrenched interests, political economy issues. And because of all these issues, we haven't seen a lot of government intervention to address these issues, and that leaves us in the state that we're in today. But as Mr. Rogers always says, when things are at their worst, look for the helpers, and there are helpers galore out there. There are a host of nonprofits working to address these issues, not just through coordinated action, government action, but by mobilizing voluntary action, producing new knowledge, and lobbying on behalf of the environment. So as the Lorax would say, speaking for the trees. Our panel today is convened to discuss these issues and these types of organizations. I think this is a really important area, so I'm both excited to highlight the great work being done and hopefully also spur interest in doing more. And so with that, I want to introduce the three fantastic scholars I've got with me today to hold our discussion on these issues. And so we'll go around the virtual room. First, we have Sandra Goff. She's an associate professor of economics at Skidmore College. She uses both lab and field experiments to explore pro-social behavior on topics such as succor and responsibility aversion and giving, the effects of emotions on ethical consumption, and the use of ecosystem services valuation in promoting environmental philanthropy. And as a fun fact, she is also an avid marathon runner, which I don't know which of all of those things is the most impressive. Claudia Schwirplies is an acting professor at the University of Hamburg. She uses both observational and experimental methods to understand the motivations, instruments, and institutions that foster contributions to environmental public goods and charities. And she was previously a visiting research scholar here at UChicago. She worked with John List, our SPY co-organizers team, I think shortly after getting your PhD. And then Beia Spiller is the lead senior economist at the Environmental Defense Fund. She has worked on a host of environmental topics that include electricity pricing and regulation, the economic impacts of shale gas, some transportation issues, gas taxes, emissions modeling, and the health impacts of air pollution. And she co-authored my personal favorite paper using the triple difference estimator with by far the most intuitive explanation of that complex identification, that complex estimator that I've ever seen, and so much so that I stole it or used it with attribution, I guess I should say, for a paper that I did. So I'm excited to bring our panel together. I'm excited to have everyone here. I'm going to begin by asking our panelists some questions for about 45 minutes. And then we'll open things up to questions from the audience. Feel free to please use the question and answer function of our webinar to ask questions at any point, and then I'll sort of ask them to the audience, or we can have folks unmute. So I want to begin by asking our panelists. I'll start with Sandra, and then sort of same question for Claudia as well. Can you just tell us a little bit, what is environmental philanthropy? Why is it important, both in general and as a research topic?
Sure. So I think I would probably define environmental philanthropy as the donation of time, money, and other resources with the intent of improving environmental outcomes. And I think that you spoke to kind of why, in general, environmental philanthropy is so important right now. You know, the results of the IPCC 2020 report, I think, kind of answers that question for us, right? In terms of research, why I think that environmental philanthropy is an important and interesting research topic. I think that's because we can't really assume that the findings that we have in the context of other causes and beneficiaries will necessarily work in the context of preservation and protection of natural resources in the environment. And so, as we might expect, there's been this significant increase in interest in environmental philanthropy over the last decade. And so I think that it's really important that we have intensive and intentional research focused on environmental philanthropy sphere to ensure that the resources that we're devoting are kind of going to their sort of highest and best use and having the impacts that we want them to have.
Yeah, so maybe I add, so why I find environmental philanthropy so important is because the environment links to almost every aspect in our life. So like health, well-being, fresh air, water, food, energy, and also our economic prosperity, right? And so almost all social causes are somehow connected with environmental issues. Yeah, so like poverty elevation, food security, migration, human rights. Yeah, and they are all somehow interrelated with environmental issues. And still we see that donations for environmental purposes are still relatively low. So I've recently seen an estimate from the UK. I think it said so around 6% of total donations are going to environmental purposes. And I have a data set from the UA, from a big donation platform. It's a bit older, so like 7 years, but here it was 2.5% of donations going to the themes environment and climate change, right? So the share of environmental donations are still pretty low. So that's why it's also important as a research topic, because we want to learn how we can increase donations for environmental causes, and what makes environmental philanthropy so special and so interesting is that the benefits are also very long run in nature, right? And they are also sometimes uncertain. Yeah, and so we have to learn if the results that we have from research do also apply, as Sandra said, to environmental philanthropy. If there are interrelations between environmentally friendly behavior, that might be interesting as well, and interrelations with environmental policy.
Great. So it seems like it's an important area, but one that there's definitely room for growth and improvement. So with that note, Beia, so you work for an environmental nonprofit, the Environmental Defense Fund. Can you tell us a little bit about EDF, its approach, the issues that you work on there, and how it is similar and or maybe different from other environmental nonprofits?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks for having me on the panel. I'm excited to be here. Environmental Defense Fund is a nonprofit advocacy organization. We leverage science and economics to find solutions to many of the really challenging, pressing environmental problems across the world. So we focus on a lot of different topics, from climate change, energy, oceans, transportation, natural infrastructure, chemicals, and there's just so many more topics that I can't even state them all. My role specifically is an economist, and I sit on a team of economists, which is kind of like an internal consulting organization, a consulting firm for the rest of the organization, in that each of the economists on staff work with the different programs to bring an economic lens to the advocacy that we engage upon. Personally, I focus on energy issues, and so I've worked with the energy program staff on electricity and transportation questions. And the part of what we do, other than sort of help with the shaping of the advocacy, is conducting research. And so the research is generally geared towards helping the program on the issues that they're engaging upon. So the fundraising related to that either comes directly through the programs who raise their own grants. We also have sort of general funds for my program for thought leadership. So foundation funds us directly to be able to do that sort of work. And then another way to go about it is project-based grant raising for specific research projects. So, in terms of how we're different from other environmental nonprofits, I want to focus on environmental advocates, because I think that's probably the ones that is in the same sphere. And we're really different from the majority of environmental advocates out there because, first of all, we're both a bipartisan and market-driven organization. So we care a lot about the role of markets, incentives, and costs, and that's pretty rare, I think, around most environmental advocacy organizations. We also are really evidence-based, so we have a lot of scientists on staff. We do have economists, and many environmental advocacy organizations don't have economists on staff. And finally, I just want to mention that EDF is always looking for sort of win-win solutions, and we take a stakeholder approach, bipartisan stakeholder approach to our policy. And so we're not just thinking about pollution reduction, but also thinking about a lot broader impacts on society, on the economy, and do care about cost minimization, which I think would be different from other environmental advocates.
I love to hear places that are using the insights of economics. That's just music to my ears. So Claudia, turning to you, the public goods that charities often provide, some of them are local in nature, some of them are global in nature, and some of them are both. And I think this is a sort of especially important distinction in the environmental context. So what are some of the determinants of whether donors are going to be focused more on local versus global issues? And what should charitable organizations be aware of? And how can they use the findings from your research on this topic to essentially build a better mousetrap?
Mm-hmm. Okay, maybe first of all, let me start with saying that people might have a preference for local public goods or the local provision of global public goods because that might yield secondary benefits, like health benefits or economic benefits. And so in stated preferences studies, interestingly, people always show a very huge preference for local public goods, right? And that's what we also see in our stated preferences study. But what we specifically find is that it's particularly people that are older, people living in rural areas who have a preference for local public goods, while it's women, people from more urban areas, and younger people who have preferences to contribute to global public goods, right? So there are other stated preferences studies that don't find that demographics somehow explain contributions to local or global public goods. They emphasize more that's about trust in the charity. And we also did a donation experiment, emphasizing that the charity provides a local public good or that the charity provides a global public good in different groups. And what we find here is that that has no impact. So it doesn't matter whether the charity provides the local or the global public good. It's more about the cause. We involved 2 charities in that experiment, and it's more about the cause. But what is interesting is that in this study, we again see that it's older people and people from rural areas who contribute more to local public goods, right? So that finding seems to be consistent. Then I'm also aware of lab experiments. They don't look so much at the determinants, but what they show is that it's particularly the social return that determines whether people give to local or to global public goods. And that's also in line with other findings from us, or with findings from us and other studies, where we see that it's particularly about the effectiveness or the belief of people about the effectiveness of the project in providing the public good, yeah, and not so much whether it's local or global in nature.
Really interesting, and I think it makes me curious as to whether that age and urban-rural breakdown, sort of whether that's driven by underlying, correlation with political affiliation, things like that, or whether that's truly coming from how preferences change as we age and that type of thing.
Yeah, we actually controlled also for political orientation.
Okay.
But it might be, I must also say the most results that I talk about are from Germany. So that might be something special about Germany. Yeah, and you might find different results in the US. But it also makes sense, right, that people from rural areas value local public goods potentially more. Yeah.
And there's, yeah. Well, I guess I would initially say I was think maybe there'd be fewer of them, but I guess maybe I don't think that's actually true. So I'd be interested to see. All right, so Sandra, in addition to the tension between local and global, there's also a tension is sort of inherent between self-interest and other regarding behavior in both philanthropy decisions and environmental decisions. What can philanthropies learn from how we evolve to both coordinate and cooperate with one another? And how can charities use these findings from your research to spur more socially optimal other regarding behavior?
Yeah, so, I think this actually does relate a little bit back to the local global discussion. And what you said when we were starting out, Chris, that we kind of know, people, governments, firms, we know what we need to do. We're just really not doing it, right? And so, which I just think is really the challenge here. Like, how do we get people to do what they know they're supposed to do? And so I think that really sort of linking to that local global discussion, I mean, most of the adaptive problems that we faced in our evolutionary history were small scale local community problems. And so we've really kind of evolved to work in these small groups, right? So on the flip side of that, many of the environmental challenges that we face are global in nature. So we've kind of have this mismatch between our evolved predispositions and the challenges that we face. And so like, how do we address these really large scale global challenges when we've sort of evolved to deal with these local challenges instead? So, the first thing that comes to mind is the interdependence hypothesis, which suggests that unconditional cooperation can evolve in a population if the environment is harsh enough, right? So that if like things are just so terrible that everybody has to cooperate in order to survive. And so clearly, getting us to focus on our interdependence would be really useful, right? For us to be able to very clearly see how interdependent we are, and how much we really need everyone to come together to address these problems would be important. We don't want to wait until our environment is so harsh that that's our only option. And clearly the 2022 IPCC report is telling us that we're nearing that threshold, right? So, that's not what we want to do. So how do we kind of get there before we have no other choice? So I think an alternative approach for philanthropies is really to focus on the small scale local environmental issues that can scale up to have really large global impacts. So things like, for example, I'm thinking back to my time living in Southern California and Long Beach and childhood asthma rates, right? Sort of linking back to what Claudia was saying at the beginning, that these are all health problems, health issues as well as, environmental issues. So if we could focus on, local air pollution and its effects on childhood asthma rates, this could scale up to have those impacts that we're looking for. I also think about just things that I'm doing on a a daily basis, sort of as an educator, making sure to teach Ostrom's core design principles when I'm teaching Hardin's strategy of the commons, and sort of inspiring that optimism, and instead of that, oh, we're really just this isn't going to work. We're all going to die. So my class just recently had a conversation about that need for optimism and how it can spur people to actually want to do the things that we need to do.
Yeah, there's a tough tension there in teaching of sort of the urgency needed and balancing that against like, well, just eat everything and die because we're kind of past the breaking point. I've definitely encountered that as well. So Claudia, given this tension that we're seeing between self-interest and other regarding behavior, and how it relates back to how we've co-evolved, sort of to work together in a more local way. You have some research on private co-benefits, and so I'm wondering how, like, sort of, you could tell us a little bit about what those are specifically, but then when might those provide a stronger motivation than public benefits, and how can charities use them, and should they be emphasizing them more?
Yeah, Sandra already touched this topic. So I said in the beginning that the primary benefits from contributing to environmental public goods are usually long-term in nature and also uncertain. Yeah, and in contrast, the secondary or the co-benefits, yeah, so I think about health benefits that Sandra already addressed, or economic benefits, yeah, they could increase utility already in the short run or the medium run, and might be associated with less uncertainty. Yeah, and that's why there's this discussion on whether we should like shift the justification of contributing to environmental public goods more to co-benefits, and to better motivate them. I've written a book chapter, I think it was about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, summarizing so what we know about co-benefits and environmental causes so far. And I think there's probably good consensus about economic co-benefits, and maybe also about intrinsic utility that you could gain from contributing to environmental public goods. Yeah, so what I mean by economic benefits is like monetary savings or monetary incentives that motivate environmentally friendly behavior. And so how organizations could use this result is maybe also like emphasize those benefits in their project description, or they could also use financial incentives to increase donations. Yeah, so there's quite some literature in the US that matches work quite well to increase donations. In Germany, they don't seem to work that well. So I tested them for environmental charities, but here we actually see that they don't increase donations. If we look at several charities in our experiment, then we just see a shift of donations. Yeah. So I must say this with a bit of caution, yeah, that this might be an instrument that could work. Yeah, so the other thing are warm glow motives. Yeah, so one way to increase utility of donors might also be to just increase their emotional utility and their feelings, yeah, to give them good feelings. And what so what the literature finds is that warm glow motives are also very relevant for environmentally friendly behavior. So organizations could try to reinforce those emotions, yeah, or also like warm glow, like pride of acting as an example. So that might work as well. So another benefit, like the health benefits, there the evidence is actually mixed. Yeah, so in some studies it works to emphasize health benefits, and others not. So I've done a study on meat eating, where we used arguments on health, on the environment, and also animal welfare. And here it's women, it's only women who respond to all three arguments, but particularly to animal welfare and to health arguments. Yeah, so there might be some groups that also respond to those arguments that on average we don't see an effect, but for some groups they might work. Yeah, but there's one experimental study that also warns to not lay so much emphasis on co-benefits, because it might might prevent positive spillover effects, yeah, if you emphasize the co-benefits too much.
Great. So, Beia, given all of these sort of competing things that we've got going on here, global, local, the self-interest, the versus other regarding, the sort of public versus co-benefits. I mean, when you are working with donors, when you're talking to donors, can you tell us a little bit about what motivates them? Are they generally focused on one issue, or sort of a lot of these different things together?
Yeah, well, that's actually kind of a challenging question to answer, because EDF receives funds from multiple different types of groups, right? We have government grants, we have foundation giving, membership, right? So private individuals, and then private donors, individuals with large funds and making large donations. Each of these is going to care about something completely different. And so we're really targeted in our approach. There's some foundations, for example, like the Sloan Foundation, who really cares about research. And they're less, they want to advance intellectual and academic understanding. Now, they do care about policy implications, but they're not sort of singularly focused on funding projects that will have a specific impact, like achieving, X tons of greenhouse gas emissions. Other donors really, really care about the impact, right? And so here's where we're getting into what Claudia and Sandra were talking about, is that some of them really care about the co-benefits, some of them really care about the greenhouse gas benefits, and it's all about how do we frame the findings, because in the end, whether you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions or reducing local air emissions, some of the solutions are very, very similar. And so you can frame the exact same project in two very competing ways for two different donors who care about very different things, and then receive the funds and basically do the exact same project. So it's a lot about framing, I think. But as I mentioned, I'm an economist. I care about research, and one of the things that I've been seeing is that for the donors who really care about impact, it's actually really hard for us to get research subsumed into that grant. In fact, what we do see is that they tend to fund, or more likely to fund, scientific research, but economic research is something that is viewed as maybe not as important by the funders when it comes to impact. And so we kind of have to not necessarily disguise what we're doing, but present it in a way that is palatable, such as, oh, we're conducting this research in order to be able to see this impact, rather than we're going to conduct this research for, getting 5 academic publications. So it's really about framing and how we approach them. And what I've been wanting to do is to see if we can try to build in more specific research questions into impact-based proposals, so that the proposals themselves result in more robust advocacy outcomes. And this is not something that's easy to do, but I'm hoping that our organization can kind of move in that direction.
It sounds like you're sort of juggling so many different competing motivations and then trying to tailor things to them, which I can't imagine how challenging that is. And then just thinking about, somebody who teaches program evaluation and thinking about how economists measure things and think about causation. I think the importance of using those tools and bringing some of those techniques in when we're evaluating the effect of different policies and programs and interventions that we're doing is definitely incredibly important, but also I know a tough sell.
Yeah, and it can also be challenging just because of timelines. A lot of donors kind of want to see fast results, they give you a 5-month grant. It's very, very hard to conduct really robust economic research in such a short amount of time. And so the timelines tend to differ quite a bit.
Yeah. So continuing on with our theme about different motivations, Sandra, how do morality and ethics come into play in this context? And do you think this is different from from philanthropy in general? And is this different from other more positive motives for donations, such as warm glow, altruism, and so on? Or is this just a mechanism through which those things operate?
Yeah, so I think that as as Claudia and Beia already said, that some of these motivations that we talk about in other contexts really matter in the environmental sphere as well. I do think that, and again, this is, of course, I think this because this is my area of research, but that morality and ethics does play a slightly larger role, I think, in environmental philanthropy. And I think that this is particularly the case, and Claudia's already brought up this concept of time preferences and uncertainty in the in environmental philanthropy. We know that the choice of discount rate we use when we're trying to measure the impacts of things like climate change really matters. We know that the choice of discount rate is also determined in part by how we value ourselves relative to future generations, which is a moral and ethical question, as well as a interest rate kind of question, right? So I think that there's that portion. So we know that philanthropic endeavors aimed at addressing climate change are going to need to work to overcome our present focus. So we need to encourage people to incur costs today, sometimes really large costs, for the benefit of individuals that haven't been born yet and will be born generations from now, half a world away, which really requires adopting a very extensive worldview. So how do we develop, how do we get people, whole societies, to adopt a larger sphere of moral obligation to others and the environment? And that's not something that I can answer today, of course. We also know, and Claudia brought this up as well, is that risk and uncertainty can play a really large role in charitable giving. There's recent research that shows that people can use risk and uncertainty as an excuse to avoid giving, sort of hide behind that as an excuse. And so we know that the scale, scope, and uncertainty in environmental philanthropy, it really provides a lot of moral wiggle room. So if I don't really know what the impacts of my actions are going to be decades from now, then that gives me a lot of space to kind of, make a lot of excuses. And so many of us, right, we all do this, right? Moral wiggle room keeps me up at night because we all engage in this behavior, and we think that our reasons for not giving or not taking action are reasons and not excuses. And so, like, how do we sort of differentiate that there? And so, the moral question also sort of factors into this, this idea that if the problem is so large that we know that it takes a global village in order to be able to address these problems, and I see that others aren't doing their part, I might also opt to do nothing because I know that my behavior is a drop in the bucket. And so some of the research that I've been doing recently has identified that we've got these kind of two groups of people: those who really believe their actions aren't going to be effective, and those who know that others won't fault them for not engaging in the behavior. And so they're really engaged in that sort of more excuse driven side. So really trying to figure out what is the framing, as Beia was saying, like what is the messaging that we can adopt that can hit these different groups of people and be effective at spurring action.
I think that moral gymnastics that we all do, and I was thinking about that from earlier, just with the war in Ukraine and wanting to donate and trying to figure out where to, and it was inaction for a few days before I finally said, well, there's no perfect answer to this, just pick one and go. And yeah, so
exactly, Chris.
I definitely feel that one, as well as see the research on it. Yes. Yeah. So Claudia, related to this notion of morality associated with environmental consumption decisions and the timing that we've got, there's also this notion of the use of offsets that I think is closely related. Can you explain what they are and how organizations are using them, and what motivates people to sort of contribute to environmental public goods in this particular way by purchasing offsets? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so carbon offsets differ, or carbon offsetting differs to charitable giving because here you are compensating a previous polluting activity. Yeah, so if I take, for example, a flight, yeah, I can go to a platform, calculate the emissions that this flight causes, and then fund a climate protection project and thereby mitigate an amount of carbon dioxide that is equivalent to the amount that my flight cost, right? Carbon offsetting is particularly useful if actively reducing emissions is associated with high opportunity costs, or if it's not possible, you have carbon-free alternatives are not available. Yeah. So what organizations do is they either collaborate with companies, so like airlines, for example, and where companies offset the emissions of their products and offer carbon-free products, or airlines include the booking machine or the donation machine on their platform, and then include in the possibility to offset in their booking process, right? But normal individuals like you and me can also go on their platforms, or companies can do, public institutions can do. We can calculate the emissions from any activity or from our yearly activities, right, or our yearly consumption, and then donate to climate protection projects to offset the emissions that are caused by them. So, and what we did in our research was, on the one hand, look at the characteristics or the attributes of those projects, that gain higher donations, and also at the characteristics of the offsetters. And we found some interesting results. So first of all, in Germany, the people are willing to pay around 30 euros per ton of CO2 emission avoidance, which is around $33. And it's a quite realistic price. So that's what 1 ton of carbon dioxide costs at the moment, and on the voluntary market, right? Then what we see is that people have a higher willingness to offset bus travels than air travels. I guess that's nothing about bus travels, but it's about the smaller absolute amounts that you have to pay to offset bus travels, right? Then what we also see in our study is that people have a higher preference for projects in their own region. That is probably because of co-benefits that we already talked about. But our respondents also had a huge preference for reforestation projects. So Germans like planting trees. And one interesting finding is also that here we also used matching and looked at what happens if the provider of the polluting activity matches the contribution of the consumer. And here we see that a one-by-one match really works great. Yeah, so that was the most important attribute here. And I think that's not only about increasing the contribution per euro, so to say, but it's also about the producer of the polluting activity making or taking his part, right? And contributing a fair share. So regarding the attributes, the characteristics of the offsetters, what we found is that it's particularly people who are convinced that offsetting is an effective instrument to mitigate climate change. It's people who support green and social politics. And it's also people who are older. That was surprising for us. So it's again, older people who offset more, and people who also generally donate to other projects, right? So what we also found in our studies was that there's a positive correlation with between offsetting and other climate-friendly activities. So there's this ongoing discussion whether offsetting is only an excuse to not reduce your emissions, but that's not in line with the positive correlation that we found. So it's people who are also doing other climate-friendly activities who are willing to offset, right? But we overall see also a high uncertainty regarding offsetting. So in Germany, at the time we did the study, it was about 10% of people who did once in their lifetime some offsetting for whatever. And I think it's still a lot of people who haven't ever heard about what that is and haven't ever done it, right? So starting points to increase carbon offsets, right, would be like to increase the knowledge about the effectiveness and the knowledge about co-benefits. Then if providers would contribute their fair share, I think that would help as well. And not only that, the consumer offset the emissions. And maybe if airlines would offer not only to offset the whole flights, but also offered to donate smaller amounts, that would maybe also help. So that are the conclusions that we draw from our findings.
Did you get the sense that the match rate there, was that in line with what we see just sort of in general for match rates in philanthropy, or was it above and beyond with that kind of? It sounds like not, but I was thinking maybe that polluters putting some skin in the game might have a.
Yeah, so what we tried was the 33% match and the 1-by-1, so 100% match. The 33% match didn't work. I think that's not in line with the results from other charitable experiments. But the 1-by-1 match worked really good. I think here we found the highest willingness to pay from all the attributes that we involved in the experiment. And colleagues of us also did a field experiment with a bus provider. And here they also see that the 1-by-1 match is the one that works best, where also later, so in later bookings, people are more willing to offset their travel.
Great. So Sandra, pivoting to you now, there's no market for the environment. So this is what I think drives a lot of research in environmental economics, of how can we, get measures of the value of environmental amenities. Does this create challenges for environmental nonprofits? And are those challenges unique to this context, or do they provide some insights to philanthropy more broadly?
So I don't think it's really all that unique of a challenge for environmental philanthropies. I think that, we have similar issues when we're trying to determine, value of a statistical life when there's, mortality and, so it's not unique, but I do think there are some challenges. So, the first challenge is, how do we actually come up with reliable, accurate estimates for, sometimes very sort of difficult to quantify values, right? So, that's an issue, but that's I think kind of probably beyond the scope of what we would be talking about here today. A lot of different methods that we can use to try to come up with numbers that are kind of good enough, right? So that we make sure we're actually accounting for the value. And not just sort of assigning a value of 0 to the environment, because that would be a mistake. But second, what do we do with this information when we do have access to it? And it's not like we don't generally see that environmental philanthropies are engaging in these valuation exercises. It's more those numbers exist as a result of some policy or planning process. And so once we have those numbers, do we want to do something with those, right? So do we want to let the public know that such and such resource is worth, $3 billion per year? Is that going to be compelling for our potential donors? And the research that I've done to date, I think I've done about 5 or 6 different studies in different contexts, and the results are kind of mixed. And so actually one of my recommendations, I guess, to charitable organizations that wanted to use this data would be, maybe don't. Because it's not really clear that it does any good, and it actually might do some harm. And so in some of the studies that I've conducted with some of my co-authors at the University of Maine, we've found that presenting economic valuation information beside our typical fundraising materials actually can serve to decrease donation amounts on average. And so that's potentially that's an issue, right? And so, there's a lot of heterogeneity in how people seem to respond to that information. So men seem to be particularly affected by that, sort of in a negative way. Women less so. Governmental beneficiaries, so like the U.S. National Park Service, we found no effect on donations to the National Park Service, but we did find effects to our private nonprofit organizations. And so this led to a field experiment with one of the partners that we use as a beneficiary in one of our lab experiments. And there we found that warm list donors were particularly negatively affected by this information. So that, again, seems kind of problematic. So.
And do you have a sense of the mechanisms there at all? Is it that people have sort of overly optimistic estimations of what these things are worth, or does putting a dollar value on it kind of kill the charitable benefit to people?
Yeah, that's less clear. So we've been trying to develop some follow-ups to try to identify what the mechanisms at play might be. Sort of in the original work that we did, we thought it was like a self-interest activation, which is sort of what psychologists were suggesting, that exposure to money and monetary value causes people to sort of activate the self-interest part of ourselves. Like money we think of self-sufficiency, and so we want to hold on to our money instead of give it away. But certainly there's a whole range of explanations for this. It could be that if we say that this resource is worth a lot, then maybe people think it pays for itself, right? So it might be that people just don't really understand this information, where it comes from, what it means. And so, it's really unclear. And I think there's a lot of really interesting directions for future research in that domain.
Fantastic. So Claudia, does a government provision of effective environmental policy, does that wind up crowding out or crowding in individual mitigation actions and other, sort of nonprofit approaches?
Yeah, Chris, that's a difficult question. I have some ideas on that, and we've also done studies on that. So first of all, I think so if people perceive environmental policy as not justified, unsuccessful, inconsistent, then this discourages people, to do or to take own mitigation action, and we did an experiment informing people about environmental policies and about environmental activities of their governments. What we see in those donation experiments is that this has no effect. And this is also in line with what we see in surveys. So when we ask in surveys whether environmental policy would motivate people or would decrease their own action, then we have around 50% in Germany and the US saying, okay, that would not impact my own action at all. We have 1/4 of people saying I would increase my own action, and we have 1/4 of people saying I would decrease my action. So I would guess from those results, overall, we would say, okay, on average, it doesn't have an effect, with some heterogeneity. And I think it's much more about not frustrating and discouraging people, with inconsistency, with unfair, with unjustified, unsuccessful policies. And in contrast to that, one result that Sandra already mentioned earlier, because obviously she found the same thing. So when we inform people about the actions or donations of other people, that definitely has an impact also on average. So that seems to be much more important than what governments do.
And Beia, how does that, I guess that sort of pick your own answer there, sort of it covers all possibles. How does that sort of comport with how EDF views both governments and other charities, sort of from the other perspective, or from your perspective inside?
Well, I mean, from the government perspective, we see government as a major collaborator and a complement to what we do. Right. A lot of what we're actually trying to implement is sort of improve and shape regulations and market-based instruments in order to achieve better outcomes. And so government has a huge role to play there in, setting the rules and regulations around markets, setting up incentives through different regulations. And so we see government as a huge asset in bringing about improved policies. And we're always working to bring our research and our understanding to them. So we're talking with legislators and agencies, or informing them of what we found, to try to get them to see how changes to their approach could improve outcomes. Now, during the Trump administration, we toned down a lot of this at the federal government level, but we shifted our efforts towards state and local governments. Since Biden's been elected, we have begun to work again at the federal level, but there's almost always a way for us to work with government and for our research to help inform policymaking. In terms of the other nonprofit organizations, I would say we're very collaborative. We seek to collaborate with many different organizations all the time. We view it as each organization has their own sort of comparative advantage. And when we want to do, for example, really research heavy work, we might call upon our research organizations such as Resources for the Future, Institute for Policy Integrity at NYU School of Law. And these are think tanks that take research really seriously, but with a policy focus. And so we can collaborate with them. We might collaborate with other organizations like NRDC or Earth Justice to do more legal work. And so, because we're collaborating with them all, and EDF is always thinking about how can we increase the amount of collaboration, where we approach collaboration as sort of a stakeholder coalition building, right? There is a finite amount of money in this world for donations, but it was Claudia mentioned, right? There's such a small amount of the donations are going to environment right now that if we can band together and make our case much more compelling to donors, and we can increase the size of the pie going to environmental giving. So I don't think we're not like necessarily competing with others for donations, and sort of view the ability to collaborate with others as a way to increase the funds that come in.
That's fantastic to hear. I think it's a really encouraging approach. So we're going to open things up to questions. We've got a few in the Q&A, and then I have a few more that I'd love to ask the panel if we have time. So the first question we got is from an anonymous attendee, but Sandra, when you were talking about optimism, this person was wondering, I think, if you use some of this, your research findings and things when you're teaching, and sort of how you bring these two things together.
Yeah, so two things about that. So first, my experience with this is pretty anecdotal at this point. Like I used to assign just Harding Tragedy of the Commons, and then I found that students were feeling very depressed about the ability to do anything to change this. And so I started adding some of Ostrom's work alongside that, which is far more positive and proactive. And so, a few of her papers that I've used, like Revisiting the Commons, I found that to be really a useful short paper for students to read alongside Tragedy of the Commons. And then just, some of her work on irrigation systems, just really seeing some examples of successful CPR management, I think makes a really big difference.
Okay, next question is for Claudia, and Sophie asks, Claudia, when you mentioned caution around overemphasizing the co-benefits because of that potentially preventing spillover effects, and Sophie's wondering if you could elaborate on that and speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, that's not my study, but I found that study particularly interesting, and I ended this co-benefit chapter that I wrote 2 years ago with that study. So that's a study. I searched for it in the meantime. So Evans et al. 2012 in Nature, Climate Change, Self-Interest, and Pro-Environmental Behavior. And what they did, if I remember correctly, so they observed two types of behaviors. One was recycling, and I don't remember what the other one was. They randomly split the groups. One was motivated with a financial incentive to do the first environmental behavior. The other was motivated with environmental arguments to do the first behavior. And then they not only looked at the take-up of the first action, but also at the other one. Yeah? And they found that financial incentives had no spillover effects to the other activities, while environmental arguments had. Yeah. So the warning was that if we emphasize the co-benefits too much, and use like health arguments, like financial incentives, that might prevent those types of spillover effects that we then overall in some have less environmental activity, right? So that was the argument here.
So then a sort of a nice follow-on question, I think, to that from Robert is other than linking to sort of local health benefits, what can we do? What is sort of the best advice do we have from the research about how we can move the needle on this problem and encourage people to engage in actions that will be beneficial? And I guess I'll open that up to anybody who wants it, if there's any volunteers.
Yeah, shall I start maybe and
Sure.
the others add? So what I learned from my research, right, is like what we see again and again is that the perceived effectiveness, so the impact that people are actually making with their donation plays a huge role. Then the fair share of the producers of polluting activities. Yeah, so if you could like motivate companies to maybe give some seed money or the matching grants, so that could maybe motivate people. Then the belief about the actions of other people. Yeah, if you use social information, so that might help a lot. The perception of environmental policy, okay, that is probably something that you could not influence that much. Financial incentives, as I said, and maybe intrinsic, so like increased psychological utility, so good feelings from giving. So that I think are the factors that I found that play the most important role.
Yeah, and I think I could add to that a little bit. I just wanted to emphasize the social information, right? Because if we are all waiting for everybody else to do something, and we feel like our action is a drop in the bucket, then we need to see that everybody is kind of is in it and is doing something. So that social information is really important. I also think trying to increase support for government intervention because we're talking about all these like individual small behaviors, right? But as Claudia is saying, like maybe the producers or the larger scale impacts are going to happen there. And so encouraging support for passing policies that are going to work at a larger scale is, I think, really important. And so some of the work that I've been doing recently with John Ifcher at Santa Clara University is trying to figure out how do we communicate environmental challenges to people in ways that cause them to be more supportive of government intervention.
And I just want to kind of follow on that, right? The approach that EDF generally takes is about changing incentives, thinking about changing incentives. So what kind of prices are people facing and how does that affect behavior? Because in the end, it's very hard to convince somebody to take an action, but when it impacts on their economics, that's when we can see movement. So getting the incentives right, I think is really important. That's from obviously this question may have been geared more towards like an individual donor and whether or not they would donate to an environmental cause. So that's, up until the Trump administration, EDF had very little membership. Actually, the majority of our funds were coming from private donors, large foundations, large donors. So it allowed us to take these, really focus on the policy issues to be able to swing the needle on incentives and markets. After Trump, it was amazing to see how many people, our membership doubled or much more than doubled. It was a huge shift. And so then we had to start thinking a little bit about how do we talk a little bit more to the public. But I do think that this approach of not trying to force everyone, to voluntarily change their ways, but setting up the incentives is probably an easier approach to get overall change.
I guess that would count as a co-benefit of the Trump administration, or I don't know, maybe that's straining things a little bit. But so Claudia, Rich asks, in the crowd out studies that you did you examine government policies that were complementary to the environmental donations, or were those policies either Hicksian or uncompensated substitutes for the service funded by the donations?
Yeah, we only investigated complementary policies. Yeah, so that are contributing exactly the same public good. Yeah, but I saw this question. I find this a very good idea for future research.
Great. Well, we are running short on time. So Sandra, I do want to ask the question about the biggest open questions and areas for research, but Sandra, if you could give us a quick answer. I guess I botched the anonymous attendees question before, but what were some of the works that you were using? I guess you sort of maybe touched on that with the Hardin and Ostrom stuff, but.
What was
the question was basically in talking about the optimism, what are the academic works that you're using in this regard?
So those are the academic work. So a variety of Austrian papers that I've added in, and to add to that too, I've been developing a study that's trying to look specifically at the introduction of these papers, or this information about successful management, to see if that actually changes behavior. So I'm planning to run some experiments in the fall that will be adding this kind of information and seeing if it increases the likelihood that somebody would engage in a pro-environmental behavior.
Okay. So Anonymous, I'm sure, I hope, Sandra, you don't mind, but reach out to Sandra if you'd like sort of more detailed sites. I'm sure she'd be happy to provide them. With that, we are out of time. I know my sort of main job here is to land things on time, and so I want to make sure I do that. And I want to thank all of our panelists. This has been incredibly informative, and I hope everyone has enjoyed. And I hope everyone will join us next month for our penultimate virtual SPY seminar. Sarah Conrath from the Lilly School will be discussing emerging perspectives on the science of philanthropy. So thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks, Chris.